So for task 1, we were asked to create a new skybox object with the correct face properties and associated six-sided textures. So within modeltools.cpp, I made a new unit box in the style of a skybox, and it accepts a size parameter that scales the box up, hopefully the correct way, so that lighting in the future still works, and then we just kind of feed it through here. And then within dxapp.h, I created the texture array for the 6 textures to be used, and then 2 references for the rasterizer state and depth stencil state. And then within dxapp.h init demo, we initialize the skybox and set its size to 500. And then we set all of the textures that we want to use for each of the faces. And then right here we create the rasterizer state, and specifically we set the fill mode, or not the fill mode, the cull mode to front so that the faces render on the inside. And then the depth stencil state, we also don't write anything to it, we zero it out so that the skybox exists as a purely background object and all geometry in the scene gets drawn on top of it. And then draw scene, yeah, we set up the skybox, and then from here we feed in each face, and then I made a render subset helper method that basically does the same thing as render, but we specifically set the start index and the index count that we want to use per face to map each texture. And then we get a nice looking skybox. So for task 2, we were asked to work with the terrain model class and set up the height map and texture inputs to properly affect the vertices heights of the terrain object. Following the instructions from the lecture slide, the terrain model constructor accepts a height map file, a desired world size, a max height, a vertical offset, and then what boils down to tiling for the texture. And then inside the constructor, we accept the height map file. And then here we set up that every pixel in the height map becomes one vertex in a grid, and then the brightness of each pixel determines how high that vertex goes. And then down here we set the height offset, the x and the size scaling, and then the tiling. And then we set up a simple renderer method to set the necessary references to context. And then within dxapp.cpp, we assign the HMTest16 texture to be used for the plane's height map, and then the actual terrain texture. And we set the map filtering to linear so that the colors are more blended between, or when they're mapped to the terrain. And then we also set the parameters of the terrain model. So the world size, the max height, the y offset, and then the tiling. And then this was already kind of set up. And then here we have the test. So for part 2 of task 2, I grabbed a seamless tile texture online, and then we set the map filtering to linear. And then the terrain height map is just a simple height map I made in GIMP, and then we set the settings.